Hello and welcome. We are going to be talking about deadlines. In an earlier module, we discussed task constraints. The first category of constraint was the flexible constraint, where you can set a task to start as soon as possible or as late as possible. Then you have your semi-flexible constraints, where you set a start date or an end date. Then you can say this project must start on or before this date, or it must start on or after this date. Same as the finish date, you say this task must finish on or before the constraint date, or it must finish on or after the constraint date. Then the last category we discussed was the inflexible or the hard constraint, where you set a start date which cannot be compromised. So in other words, we say this task must start strictly on this particular date. And also you can set an end date and say this task must finish strictly on this particular date. So putting a constraint on a project reduces your flexibility in terms of scheduling. So instead of constraining yourself, you'd rather use deadlines, because the deadline will check whether the date you set has been observed or the task has gone beyond that date, and then it simply indicates to you and you take corrective action. So instead of setting constraints, what we can do is to set a deadline rather on that particular task. We need to identify the latest date by which you want the task to be completed, and you set it as the deadline. So latest completion date becomes your deadline. So the deadline does not constrain the scheduling. It's just an indicator. It has no effect, it has no force on the plan. Once you set the deadline, a deadline symbol is displayed on the chart portion of the Gantt chart view. If a task then moves past or beyond its deadline date, then you get an indicator which is called a missed deadline indicator, and it's a red exclamation mark which appears in the indicators field. The indicators field is on your extreme left on the table portion of the Gantt chart. Remember, the Gantt chart has a table on the left and it has got a chart on the right hand side. So once the deadline has been exceeded, you can then take some corrective steps. Next, I'm going to show you how to set a deadline on a task. So let me select this task that says build foundation wall. So you select the task, then you go to the task and then properties, group, then information. If you still remember, we said to open this task information, you could also simply double click on the task name. So if you were to double click on the task name, it would have simply opened the same window. Then we go to the Advanced tab. On the Advanced tab, we go under Deadline. So the default is non-applicable, but once we click on the drop down here, we get the calendar. To set a meaningful deadline, we need to go back to the General tab so that we can check what is the start date and completion date for this particular task. So it's supposed to finish on the 31st of 10/2020. So we can set a deadline which is the following day if it is not a weekend. So we go back to advanced and deadline, go back to November 31st is a Saturday, then Sunday is a 1st, so we can set our deadline for the 2nd of 11, and then we say OK. So once we set that deadline, you can see that the deadline indicator, which is this green arrow pointing down, shows on the date Monday, the 2nd of November. So if we go to the table portion on this activity, this task, you can see that the indicators field here is not showing anything because that deadline was not exceeded or has not yet been exceeded. So it's only after the deadline is exceeded, that is when you see that red exclamation mark here to show that the deadline has been exceeded. If for any reason you'd like to remove the deadline, all you do is you go back to the task properties by double clicking or going to the task and then information, then you go to advanced and we clear the deadline information. So all I've done is simply to highlight and to delete whatever was inside there. So there's no more deadline. If you went back, advanced, deadline now says none applicable. So I'm going to put it back in November 2nd. Okay, and it's back. So that is your deadline. This is much better than putting constraints, especially the semi-flexible and the hard inflexible constraints. So please do play around. You can put deadlines on one or two of the tasks on your project plan, and then don't forget to save your project so that when you get to the stage of submitting your file, I can see that you have done the exercises. So I need to see some tasks with deadlines. So don't be clever and not do the deadline. Then you say to me, oh, I did 5 deadlines, then I cleared all of them. So there's now none left. So I want you to leave some of them. Don't clear all your deadlines from your practice file. So I'll see you in the next module.